All right, hi, welcome back. So last week we started to discuss population ethics, and we read a little bit from Hardin, who of course views the growing human population as a dire threat, as an increasingly dire threat as the population gets bigger and bigger. And a lot of people who don't agree necessarily with Hardin's solutions, they still think that he's right in that there is a problem here. As the population gets bigger and bigger, it's putting increasing pressure on the environment, and it's a major contributor to issues like the problems with pollution or problems with climate change, for example. Now, today we're going to take a look at two opposing views on how to approach this problem. Of course, Hardin, he wanted government regulation of the right to reproduce in the same way that he felt the government should control access to any other common pool resource. And a lot of people disagree with that on ethical grounds. They say, look, the right to reproduce and the right to plan the family that you want to have is one of the most fundamental and intimate rights that human beings have, and you just don't mess with it. Hardin, his response to this kind of criticism is always to say, look, ethics is a function of context. So if in context the growing population is serious enough of a threat like it is right now in the world right now, then actions that otherwise would be deemed unethical are in fact not only necessary but ethical. So Carol Cates is someone who agrees with Hardin. She says, look, the governments do need to regulate population growth, but her approach to why this is okay to do, or her justification for why this is okay to do, is a little bit more sophisticated than Hardin's. She talks about it in terms of the social contract. So the idea behind a social contract is that when you live in a society, you basically agree to give up certain rights in order to get the protections and benefits of living in that society. And this especially concerns freedoms that might harm other people. You give these up in order to be part of society. So Kate says, look, in the world that we live in today, unrestricted reproduction in a growing population, these are big enough of a threat and they're harmful enough to other people that the government is justified in restricting the growth of the population. And that's just part of living in a society that you give up freedoms that are harmful to others. And so the government has every right ethically to control reproduction. Now, what might be a little bit concerning about this is that a lot of people might get on board with this when we're talking about cases where we're trying to avoid overpopulation. But that's not always the case. Sometimes underpopulation is the problem in some places. And what happens then? By the flip side of the same coin, does the government have the right to come in now and force people to have children that they don't want to have? And this isn't really a hypothetical question. This happened as recently as the 1970s and 80s in Romania, where they were trying to grow the population to become a superpower. So women were required to have a bunch of children. If they didn't, they could go to jail. They could be arrested and go to jail. So Gita Sen, she approaches this problem differently. And first of all, she says, look, reproductive rights that's part of being a human being. You just don't touch, the government's got no right to touch those. Nobody has a right to touch people's reproductive rights. But she also points to a split in how environmentalism is viewed between the developing and the developed world, which she calls the northern and southern world. And a lot of people in the southern world in developing countries, they view environmentalism as like this hobby that rich Europeans and Americans have, and people in the rest of the world are busy just trying to stay alive and feed their families, and they don't have time for this kind of nonsense. And a lot of the time, Sen points out that when environmentalists from these developed countries or northern countries, they come in and they try to set up family planning programs, they're not taking the interests of the local population into account whatsoever. And what they're doing a lot of the time is actually harmful for the people who live there. Now, Sen says that the only way that environmentalists are ever going to succeed is to recognize that their goals a lot of the time they align with the people in these poor countries, especially the feminists there, and they need to fundamentally change how they're operating. What they need to do is to take into account the local population and especially the women who live there, because the women often have very little decision making power in a lot of societies or very little control over their lives, but it's women who bear the brunt of decisions about population ethics. They're the ones who suffer when wrong decisions are made. And if women are not empowered, you're never going to find a solution to population problems. So, Sen's solution obviously is very different. She's against any kind of like people going in and doing these heavy-handed planning programs, and she's especially against any kind of coercive control over reproductive rights. She says, look, the answer is to empower women. It's not to have any kind of coercive control. But Sen is pointing here to kind of a bigger issue that'll be a theme throughout this course, which is how we should understand environmentalism and why should we be concerned about the environment in the first place. And this is she raises a good point in that environmentalism is usually something that's coming from the developed world. It's coming from like Europe and America and Australia and Canada, places like this. But the cost of environmental action, it often falls disproportionately on people in the poorer world. And this kind of part of this comes down to why we should even value the environment in the first place. Do we value biodiversity in nature for its own sake, or is the environment there? Is the environment just there so that humans can use it, and is that why we're concerned with it as like a resource for humanity? And how we should view the environment and how this affects the policies that we put in place, and how we want to balance environmental policies against the concerns of people in the developing world and their right to economic development and prosperity. These will be something that we need to think about throughout this entire class. So you guys will have an opportunity to discuss these issues with Lisa on Friday, and I will see you on Wednesday.